Welcome to Wisp Tales, where famous lives get their shadows back. Today, the real story behind Benjamin Franklin's hidden life, from secret clubs and basement bones to private letters and power plays. Settle in. Let's meet the man behind the myth. London, late 1750s. A narrow Georgian house at 36 Craven Street sits a few minutes' walk from the Thames. By day, it's a respectable address with a printer-statesman lodging upstairs, quills scratching, visitors rotating through the parlor. By night, the place becomes a crossroads. Philosophers and pamphleteers, surgeons and skeptics, all orbiting a colonial agent named Benjamin Franklin. He's already a celebrity in England. Electricity shows with crackling jars and playful shocks, but his real work happens quietly. Letters drafted in code-like politeness, introductions arranged, ideas exchanged under candlelight where reputations won't get singed. Decades later, workers renovating that same house will uncover something that turns headlines hot. Hundreds of human and animal bones in the basement, signs of clandestine anatomical study from Franklin's time. Not a murder dungeon, despite the whispers, more likely a backstairs school of dissection run by his protégé, the brilliant young anatomist William Hewson. Still, the image lingers, a founding father above, science in the shadows below. That's not a scandal. It's a motif. Franklin's life is a pattern of front-stage virtue and backstage experiment, public thrift and private appetite. If you want to find the real man, you look where the light doesn't quite reach. Franklin learned early to keep multiple ledgers. As a printer's apprentice in Boston, he wrote under masks. Silence Dogood, the witty widow who skewered piety with a smile, because truth often travels better when it borrows a costume. In Philadelphia, he built a civic empire that looked like pure benevolence. Libraries, fire brigades, hospital, paving and lighting committees, and it was benevolent. But it was also tactical. Networks are power. And Franklin's networks threaded every room that mattered. He called one of them the Junto, a Friday night club of tradesmen and thinkers with rules on how to disagree without drawing blood. Members debated morals, money, and city improvement projects. In practice, they also promoted one another, shared news before it was news, and tested ideas where failure wouldn't leave a bruise. Behind his charm, Franklin kept a notebook of self-mastery. 13 virtues, tracked with tiny black marks for lapses. He fails often, records it anyway, and tries again. That page is the public Franklin. Industrious, frugal, humane. The private Franklin is more complicated. He writes a notorious, never-meant-for-print letter on choosing a mistress, half jesting, half revealing. He adores intelligent company and is gallantly entangled with witty salonières in Paris. He manages a common-law marriage with Deborah Reed that's tender and thorny, interrupted by years abroad, and complicated by a son born out of wedlock long before. He can be both sentimental and calculating, both humane and late to moral clarity, owning enslaved people in his early middle age before evolving into a loud abolitionist at the end, petitioning Congress to abolish the trade and then slavery itself. A ledger, updated, in ink. In London, Franklin moves like Mercury, between coffee houses and court corridors, from scientific demonstrations to private dinners where the real deals are arranged. He sends polished essays to the Royal Society while quietly sheltering experiments that would raise eyebrows, like Hewson's dissections in the Craven Street cellar. Necessary for a medicine still learning anatomy the hard way. He flatters dukes, befriends shopkeepers, and cultivates women whose salons steer reputations. His currency is usefulness. His creed is persuasion. Electricity taught him a lesson he never forgot. To move charge, you need a path. To move people, you need a circuit. Franklin built circuits. The hidden life isn't a single secret, it's a method. He hides in plain sight, behind pen names, behind committees, behind the pleasant fog of hospitality. He can be utterly frank on paper and infuriatingly oblique in person. Genial as a hearth fire, while calculating which log to add next. The man who taught the world about lightning rods spends years quietly leaking and reading private letters during the pre-revolution crisis, then wears the public outrage those leaks cause like a crown he pretends he doesn't want. He is, in short, a master of two-level games: science and theater, virtue and appetite, liberty and leverage. Tonight, we'll walk both floors of Franklin's life, the bright parlor and the shadowed cellar. We'll sit in the Junto, decode his virtue charts, read his spicier letters in their true context, follow his Freemason networks, and step into the rooms where diplomacy was done without minutes or microphones. We'll watch him change his mind about slavery, strategize in Paris like a cheerful spider at the center of a golden web, and return home a national treasure who still kept private grievances in tidy folders. You'll see why the myth is shiny, and why the real story, with its drafts and smudges, is better. Before Franklin ever wore velvet in Paris salons, he learned to disappear inside a voice. In Boston, a teenage apprentice barred from his brother's newspaper column, he slipped a letter under the door signed "Silence Do-Good," a fictional widow with a sly tongue. The town loved her. The editor printed every piece. The household cheered until the mask dropped and the brother raged. Lesson logged. A good pen name isn't just camouflage, it's a testing lab. With a mask, he could say what Boston wouldn't let Benjamin say. He would use that trick for decades. Busybody, Richard Saunders of Poor Richard's Almanac, and half a dozen one-off personas that floated trial balloons without puncturing his reputation if they came down wrong. When he reached Philadelphia, with printer's ink still under his nails, he began building something more durable than a pseudonym: a network. Friday nights, a handful of artisans and shopkeepers gathered in a back room, an intentionally modest circle called the Junto. The rules were disarmingly civil: arrive prepared with a question worth the room's time, disagree without heat, keep secrets that would burn a friend, and, crucially, turn bright talk into public action. Out of those candlelit debates came the shells of institutions that still sound like daylight: the library company, share books so ideas don't stay locked in private studies, a volunteer fire brigade, civic safety before profit, plans for paving, lighting, and cleaning streets, virtue as infrastructure. The Junto looked like friendship. It functioned like distributed influence. A club with no uniforms that gradually put the entire city in better order. Franklin understood leverage in human form. He courted the humble, the joiner, the bookseller, the schoolmaster, because a dozen small nodes tied together outperformed one loud patron. He wrote solicitations that made donors feel wise rather than wealthy. He asked for subscriptions, many small gifts, instead of alms, one large perishable favor. He minted a public self that people could invest in. The early riser, the plain dresser, the man of 13 virtues, who tallied his lapses in a tiny notebook the way a merchant tallies costs. He failed temperance on Monday, and industry on Thursday, and admitted both on Friday. The honesty was strategic. Confession without scandal creates trust, and trust, stacked carefully, becomes permission to attempt larger projects. In print, Franklin's jokes were moral lessons wearing bells. In private, he trained a colder lens. He saw that reputation is compound interest. If the town believed he was useful, then bolder proposals, insurance for widows, a Pennsylvania hospital, a college, could pass under the same banner of utility. He made room for other men's names on mastheads and plaques, an act that looked generous and was, also, an investment. A dozen grateful allies were worth more than one jealous rival. The Junto taught him to sponsor people the way he sponsored ideas. Not all of it was daylight. Even as he published Thrift and Temperance, the private ledger ran parallel. A son born out of wedlock, William. A common-law marriage with Deborah Reed, sustained across long absences. Flirtations that fluttered around letters, and business moves that slipped through gray zones with a printer's pragmatism. He wasn't a hypocrite so much as a man operating on two channels. Public virtue as scaffolding, private appetite as weather, and the building still rising between them. When enemies called him slippery, he smiled and added a brace to the scaffolding. When friends called him exemplary, he shrugged and returned to the workbench. Both assessments were true enough. By the time London beckoned, Franklin had learned the trick that would define his hidden life: mask the ambition in service. If the proposal lit streets, educated apprentices, or put books in rough hands, the town embraced it, and, by reflection, embraced him. And so the printer built a platform strong enough to hold a politician, a scientist, and, eventually, a diplomat whose greatest skill was making other people think an idea had been theirs all along. The Junto adjourned on Fridays. Its method never adjourned at all. The public Benjamin Franklin was born twice, once as a printer who minted civic common sense, and again as a showman of the invisible, electricity. In the 1740s and early 50s, before London, he turned a Philadelphia parlor into a laboratory where the furniture doubled as apparatus and friends doubled as assistants. On a winter evening, you might find a glass tube being rubbed to a glow, a Leyden jar primed like a bottled storm, and Franklin arranging small experiments with the calm of a man setting a breakfast table. He disliked pomp, but he understood theater. A line of gilt-lettered pamphlets would never travel as far as a gasp from a live audience. He coined words: battery, conductor, charge, positive and negative, not because he craved fame for naming, but because the world had no shared language for this strange new fire, and without words, curiosity dissolves into spectacle. In that room, he discovered the one fluid theory, not two mysterious substances wrestling inside bodies, but a single electrical fluid whose surplus and deficit created the behavior. It was a risky simplification that fit the facts at hand and gave experimenters a compass. His letters to Peter Collinson in London read like dispatches from a front, observations polished into prose, little dramas in which silk threads, cork balls, and a boy on a wax cake performed secrets on command. The single most durable lesson was not a trick, but a translation. Lightning and the spark from your knuckle are the same thing on different budgets. If so, then a storm is not a tantrum from heaven,
It is a machine. The kite is the story everyone tells, embroidered with brass keys and cinematic peril. The rod is the real revolution.
Franklin's plan was elegant. Mount a pointed metal rod above a building, tie it by wire to the earth, and give lightning a safe stairway home. Pointed, because points bleed charge into the air, calming the local field before a bolt decides to jump. Grounded, because the shortest path wins. He argued it with the same calm he used to argue for libraries. Then he installed rods and watched insurance rates move, the market nodding yes. The invisible, made useful, becomes real even to skeptics. But science is never just facts, it's also factions. In London, after his colonial fame had arrived ahead of him, Franklin found himself in a genteel brawl over whether rods should be pointed, his view, or blunt, championed by rivals like Benjamin Wilson. The debate mixed theology, ought man draw lightning? With geometry, which shape discharges better? Franklin's response was to stay empirical and slightly amused. Try both, count the strikes, follow the burn marks. The church spires of Europe became laboratories. Thunderstorms did the peer review. The verdict favored the point. Still, the controversy taught him a transferable lesson. Winning minds required giving opponents a dignified exit. He let the data speak and the newspapers translate. His prize was not triumph, but adoption. To the Royal Society, he charmed and challenged in equal measure. He would stand in a plain coat among periwigs, demonstrate a small outrage of nature, electric bells ringing from a cloud in a jar, and then hand around his conclusions like bread at table. Honors followed, medals, memberships, but the true currency was reliability. He described only what he had seen and what a person with a steady hand could repeat. If his fame grew, it was because artisans and peers could stand in their own rooms, move their own needles, and reach the same numbers. He made replication a kind of hospitality. Electricity, like printing, schooled him in systems. He watched how charge moved along a path of least resistance and how insulation, not absence, but separation, guided where the force would go. The metaphor climbed quietly into his politics and diplomacy. He began to wire rooms full of people the way he wired jars and rods. Join these, separate those. Offer a safe path for energies that might otherwise explode. He taught cities to wear lightning rods and taught himself to be one, grounded, unshowy, and built to draw fire in a way that kept the house from burning. The hidden life gathers skills where the public life doesn't think to look. And because he could be playful, even when the stakes were solemn, he turned the lessons into parlor talk that stuck like a tune. Bottles store storms, points pacify tempests. Nature prefers an exit to an argument. His friends left with their hair unsinged and their world slightly reorganized. If you needed a man one day to divert a political thunderhead, who better than the printer who had taught electricity to mind its manners? London liked Franklin because he made complicated things sound neighborly. But beneath the parlor at 36 Craven Street, the conversation turned anatomical. During renovations in the 1990s, workmen found a cache that fed headlines, hundreds of human and animal bones in the soil under the house, many with fine saw marks and trepanation holes. Reduce noise. The tabloids wanted a Gothic father of the Republic. The truth was less lurid and more revealing. In Franklin's years there, His brilliant young friend William Hewson, pupil of the famed William Hunter, used the building as a backstairs anatomy school. Dissection was essential to medicine and legally scarce. Cadavers came from the margins of society and arrived by euphemism, sometimes through the midnight commerce of resurrection men. It was science done in a narrow legal hallway, and Franklin knew. Upstairs, Franklin drafted letters to London grandees and colonial assemblies. Downstairs, Hewson mapped lymphatic vessels, injected colored wax into the body's secret rivers, and taught a handful of students to trade superstition for structure. The saw marks on the bones weren't ritual. They were method. Careful cuts to expose joints, skull, and flow. When Hewson died young, infected during a dissection, Franklin wrote elegies and kept friendships with the family. He did not trumpet the cellar, but neither did he stop it. That quiet consent tells us how he weighed things. Public order in the parlor, progress in the cellar, a gentleman's discretion joining the floors. The Craven Street house became a diagram of Franklin's two-level thinking. He entertained bishops and philosophers where the windows faced the street. He let the future of surgery inch forward where the lamps burned low. He believed in useful knowledge, the kind that lowers fire risk, reduces smallpox, shortens suffering, and he accepted that useful knowledge often begins in rooms the public finds uncomfortable. Later, when he backed inoculation against smallpox and pushed for civic health measures, he was drawing a straight line from the basement bones to daylight policy. Understand the body honestly, and you can govern a city more humanely. There is an ethical sting here, and Franklin felt it. The age's anatomy trade exploited poverty and powered discovery. He could have slammed the door, but he chose instead to stand in the uncomfortable middle, tacit patron of a necessary discomfort. That posture appears again and again in his hidden life. He will flirt with power to move a public good. He will use private tact to keep a fragile advance from being strangled by scandal. The printer's instinct to get the sheet out, correct tomorrow, guided the physician's cellar as well. Learn first, then teach safely. Years later, when the bones were counted and catalogued, the story refused melodrama and chose complexity. Franklin's natural habitat. The tidy moral is not that he was a secret ghoul, it is that he housed difficult progress and wore the risk for it. A lightning rod for controversy above, a school of human truth below. Between them, a staircase that only a few climbed, and those who did changed what doctors knew. Franklin's greatest explosion didn't involve lightning, it involved letters. In 1772, with the colonies seething over taxes and troops, a packet of private correspondence reached his hands in London. Letters written years earlier by Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson and Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver. The tone was calm, the proposals sharper than the ink admitted. Tighten authority, curb liberties, nudge Parliament to abridge colonial freedoms for the sake of order. Nothing in them was a smoking gun of treason. Everything in them, read out loud in Boston, would feel like one. Franklin, acting as colonial agent, didn't publish the letters himself. He sent them quietly to be read in confidence by a few leaders, hoping the revelation would aim anger at the right men and cool the street.
It was a sophisticated plan, reassign the lightning from London to local officials and diffuse a broader revolt. But politics hates half-measures. The letters leaked beyond the tight circle. Boston printed and burned with righteous theater. The town square did what town squares do. Suddenly, Franklin, still in London, found himself accused of theft and subversion. He had neither stolen nor forged them, but he had moved them, and movement is offense enough when reputations are involved. The Privy Council summoned him to Whitehall for a hearing that promised the semblance of law and the appetite of a crowd. The scene is one of the era's crueler tableaux. A winter room heavy with wigs and smirks. Franklin, 68, standing silent in plain brown cloth, hands behind his back. Across from him, the Scottish Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn, sharp as a boning knife, rose to carve. He called Franklin a thief, a man of low cunning, an agent fit for tavern tricks. He turned the room into a playhouse and Franklin into a prop. Friends urged a defense. Franklin refused. He did not glower or plead. He simply absorbed the show, a human lightning rod, letting the storm spend itself to ground. When the noise ended, the council stripped him of his London post as Deputy Postmaster General. He bowed and left. Why the silence? Because the theater was the point. Any speech by Franklin would have given the performance a second act and a different villain. By keeping his mouth shut, he made Wedderburn own every ounce of malice. Outside the room, the story inverted. A gentleman insulted for defending his countrymen's rights. Franklin lost an office and gained a role he preferred, provoked patriot with impeachable composure. The hidden life had executed one of its neat flips. Eat the humiliation now, convert it to influence later. I never before was so sensible of the power of a good character, he would write. Reputation, patiently compounded, had paid its dividend when it mattered. The affairs affair also snapped a private thread. Franklin had spent a decade in London practicing the art of friction reduction, nudging ministries, lubricating committees, buying time with compliments. The public Benjamin, amiable, witty, the American who dressed a little homely to flatter British expectations, had believed the empire could be mended. After Whitehall, the mask hardened. He shipped his furniture from Craven Street, boxed his friendships, and prepared to cross an ocean as someone England would no longer recognize. The printer who once stitched compromises began setting type for a clean break. Hidden beneath the scandal was another contested loyalty. Franklin's son William, polished and promising, had climbed to the royal governorship of New Jersey and favored the crown. Father and son had made a political duet for years, one public, one slightly more courtly, but the letters crisis and the spiral into war split the harmony. In time, William chose king over Congress, was arrested, and would exit the revolution as a Loyalist exile. In family terms, that was the costliest leak of all. The private man lost a son to the same storm the public man helped organize. Back in Philadelphia by 1775, Franklin kept the Whitehall silence as a tool. He let others thunder in the Continental Congress while he counted votes, wrote drafts, and made enemies comfortable enough to slide toward agreement. He knew now what the Hutchinson episode had taught, that outrage is easy to aim and hard to park. He took charge of mail, the veins of the rebellion, because information is both currency and oxygen. He chaired committees with the patience of a surveyor measuring a crooked lot.
And when it came time to send a delegation to France to find money, guns, and a navy, he accepted the obvious assignment. The man who had stood still and swallowed British theater would cross the water to stage a subtler play. The hidden life's technique, move documents, hold your tongue at the crescendo, substitute reputation for rebuttal, had not been petty intrigue. It had been practice. In Paris, he would need it all. But that is another room, another language, and another set of candles guttering in salons where whispers outrun letters and alliances are written first in glances. When Franklin arrived in France at the end of 1776, he stepped into a city that ran on conversation the way London ran on law. Paris was candles, carriages, and salons, rooms where power floated in the air between a duchess's question and a philosopher's reply. Franklin dressed the part of a legend by not dressing the part at all. Plain coat, spectacles, sometimes the famous fur cap that painters adored and ministers suspected was a costume. He understood that diplomacy has two layers: what you sign and what people believe about who signed it. The carefully curated rustic sage, a man who seemed to have walked out of a Roman virtue manual and into the Faubourg Saint-Germain, gave France permission to love America without loving all its mess. The official court ran through Vergennes, the foreign minister, who measured his words as if they were gold dust. The unofficial pipeline ran through Beaumarchais, playwright, fixer, and proprietor of a shadow company called Rodrigue Hortalez N.C. that funneled gunpowder and muskets across the Atlantic while France pretended neutrality. Franklin charmed both streams while keeping his ledgers straight enough to survive future audits. He knew that France did not adore Republican sermons. It adored wounding Britain at a profit. So he told the American story as a good investment, a young nation with will, markets, and gratitude that could be banked. His rooms at Passy, just outside Paris, became a second Junto with silk upholstery. Mornings brought couriers and account books. Afternoons brought visitors who wanted volts and wit. He demonstrated glass harmonicas and harmless electrical parlor tricks to duchesses whose brothers sat on war councils. He wrote in French that was not perfect but was frank and elegant, an honesty the French mistook for innocence until they realized it was policy. With Madame Brillon, he played duets and traded clever letters. With Madame Helvétius in Auteuil, he flirted as a widower who liked laughter more than solitude. These friendships were not games, they were infrastructure, corridors through which favor flowed. In the back rooms, the work ran on ciphers and loans. Franklin negotiated secret subsidies while the ink on American promises was still damp, then turned those subsidies into public treaties after Saratoga convinced France the rebellion could become a war Britain might lose. In February 1778, two documents came to life: a treaty of amity and commerce, acknowledging the United States as something more than a rumor, and a treaty of alliance, pledging French war against Britain. Franklin staged the signing with serene gravity, then let the news spread like perfume through the city. The fur cap had done its share, so had the ledgers Beaumarchais kept in invisible ink. Allies made the work broader and messier. Arthur Lee, dogged and suspicious, saw conspiracies everywhere, sometimes correctly. John Adams, exacting and industrious, brought a New England impatience to a country that considered punctuality a provincial habit.
Reduce noise. Franklin absorbed their friction with the same posture he had used at Whitehall. Listen, say less, produce results. He kept the Dutch bankers warm, prodded Spanish channels to open a little, and coaxed Lafayette, the excitable marquis who loved America as if it were an idea he had written, into being both a symbol and a courier of influence between armies and salons. Money never slept. Franklin issued American loan certificates to Parisians who liked the romance of funding a republic. He bargained for convoys so American ships could slither through British teeth. He approved prize cases from American privateers who dragged British cargo into French ports, while everyone agreed to call it something else. He read the mail as if it were weather, which it was. British agents tried to smear him. He countered with silence and signatures. When news of Yorktown broke in 1781, he smiled like a man whose long bet had just paid with interest, then immediately set about transforming victory into cash and credit. Wars end on paper. He wrote the kind that mattered. Health carved its own footnotes. The old printer's body complained. Gout as sharp editor, stones that announced themselves rudely, but he worked from bed when he had to, dictating letters while the city's gossip breezed in through open windows. He did not pretend purity. He managed familial ache from a distance. William, his Loyalist son, now a political opposite, and poured grandfatherly affection into Temple Franklin, who moved through Paris as both assistant and bright advertisement for the family name. Franklin knew that posterity would stitch its own robe for him. He tried to supply the better fabric. By 1783, the American mission had drifted from survival to settlement. The Treaty of Paris required a different theater, direct negotiation with British envoys who wanted commerce without conceding face. Franklin used the same rule he used with electricity: give the force a safe exit. He pressed for independence, fisheries, western boundaries, and as much financial sanity as the moment allowed. Then let the British tell their Parliament that they had obtained from the Americans what in truth the Americans had taken. He wrote the last pages with a calm that felt inevitable to everyone but the men who had swapped bribes for bullets to get there. The hidden life in Paris is not a scandal. It is a method perfected. Franklin made an image that opened doors, relationships that carried messages, and accounts that held under audit. He played music with women who steered men, who steered ministries. He performed science to make politics feel safe, and he performed simplicity to make complexity forgivable. When he finally turned his face toward Philadelphia, he left behind debts, friendships, 2 or 3 broken hearts, and a European conviction that the United States had manners enough to be trusted and stubbornness enough to be respected. He came home in 1785 to parades, bells, and a body that had earned its limp. Philadelphia put him in a carriage and into committees the way a river puts debris into eddies, inevitably. The genial mask still fit, but the needles underneath were sharper. As president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, a governor by another name, Franklin practiced the same old craft: make opponents comfortable, make outcomes firm. He hosted dinners that did more work than speeches, and wrote notes that moved more votes than orations. The printer's shop had become a house whose rooms ran on quiet deals.
2 years later, he took his seat at the Constitutional Convention, 81 years old, gouty and indispensable. The hall was hot, the tempers hotter. Madison and Hamilton arrived with blueprints,
State delegations arrived with guardrails. Franklin rarely led a fight. He closed them. When the room nodded, he rose slowly and suggested a recess long enough for pride to cool or a compromise to find its shape without witnesses. He played host at the city tavern, where wine softened daggers, and he read drafts the way he read proofs, spotting errors invisible to the enthused. He didn't love every clause that survived, least of all the silences about slavery. But he believed in governance the way he believed in bridges. Imperfect structures bear weight if you tend them. And at the end he gave the room a story it could live with, the rising sun on Washington's chair, because a country needs a picture more than a paragraph. In private, his abolition ledger had flipped. The man who once owned enslaved people had long since freed the last person in his household and thrown his weight behind the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, serving as its president. In 1790, in his final public act, he signed a petition to Congress asking the new government to end the trade and take steps toward abolition. The House thanked him, argued, and deferred. Southern members hissed about dangerous precedents. Franklin's answer was mischief as morality. Under the pen name Sidi Mehemet Ibrahim, he published a razor-edged satire that put pro-slavery arguments in the mouth of a fictional North African justifier of white enslavement. The logic collapsed on contact. He had used persona to advance civic life his whole career. The last mask he wore was aimed at a wound he had once helped make. The private man kept paying private prices. Deborah Reed, his partner in a long and weathered common-law marriage, had died while he was in London years before. Guilt lingered in the margins of letters he never sent. With William, the Loyalist son he had once groomed, reconciliation never fully landed. They met, circled old arguments, reached for neutral topics, and ran aground on memory. Franklin put affection into Temple, William's son, whose Paris years had been a bright diversion, but whose American years were a harder fit. Family is a kind of politics. Even Franklin could not draft a treaty that pleased every party. He revised his autobiography in spare hours, the most charming unfinished manuscript in American letters, stopping short of the Revolutionary years, as if to say, "Here are the tools, you know the storm." The 13 virtues returned, tidy and plausible, a young man's scaffold remembered by an old one who knew the wind loads better now. He wrote practical pieces till the end, on paper currency, on stoves and street sweeping, on the sort of municipal details that keep freedom from tripping on its own shoelaces. He sent small donations with big notes attached. Use this for apprentices. Keep this library open late. Publish the minutes so the poor can see how the city is run. Spring of 1790 came with pain and a sense of account closing. He signed papers, dispatched final petitions, and accepted visitors who wanted a look at a living emblem before he turned into a portrait. On April 17th, he died with the city he built just outside the window. The funeral pulled a crowd that looked like Franklin's favorite sentence: useful people, artisans, printers, merchants, widows, free men in their Sunday coats, walking behind a plain coffin while the bells of Philadelphia said the word they knew best: together.
What was hidden, in the end, was never a single scandal. It was a method. 2 ledgers, public benevolence and private appetite, reconciled by constant edits. Masks used not to deceive, but to test and to persuade. Networks treated as infrastructure. Science turned into policy by way of parlor tricks and patient prose. And when the century shifted, Franklin shifted with it, from accommodating empire to creating a nation, from tolerating bondage to attacking its logic in print and petition. His genius was not sainthood, it was adjustment to facts, to people, to a future he wanted to arrive in one piece. Stand at Craven Street's parlor and imagine the cellar. Stand at Independence Hall and picture the tavern after hours. Thread those rooms with the same man, carrying a calm that moved storms and a smile that provided cover while the work got done. That is the real story behind the hidden life. A printer's patience applied to a country. Set the type, ink the plate, pull the proof, correct the error, print again, until something durable lies drying on the table. Before Franklin was a diplomat with silk-lined ledgers, he was a printer who understood that money is a story written on paper. In the 1720s and 30s, Philadelphia pulsed with trade, but starved for coin. Hard silver drifted toward London the way rivers run to sea, and shopkeepers were left making change with promises. Franklin argued, audaciously for a young tradesman, that a well-regulated issue of paper currency could oil the city's gears. His pamphlet, A Modest Enquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, dressed radical economics in homespun logic. If the town has hands to work and fields to fill, why should commerce wait on a ship from Bristol? He wasn't inflating on whim. He was proposing a controlled credit that matched real labor and land. When the Assembly listened, he landed more than a policy win. He won contracts to print the notes. Printing money sharpened his craft into an art of trust. Counterfeiters loved smooth borders and repeating patterns. Franklin answered with nature. He pressed real leaves, veins and all, into plaster molds, then used those molds to create unique, unforgeable impressions on bills. Nature prints that made every 5-shilling note as singular as a signature. He mixed mica into the ink so legit currency glittered faintly in daylight, and fakes sulked matte. He tinkered with mismatched type ornaments and deliberately imperfect borders, traps for the eye and the greedy thumb. Each bill became a small sermon on complexity as security, the world's textures, borrowed and fixed in ink to keep rogues honest. Up close, the shop taught him a nation's math. Paper wasn't just fiber, it was policy embodied. Too much, and prices walked off their leashes. Too little, and trade limped. He watched printers in other colonies celebrate the press while starving at the till. He chose contracts that fed his apprentices and allowed him to stock good paper for books, almanacs, and pamphlets that then fed the town. The almanac, under the wisecracking mask of Richard Saunders, folded those lessons into jokes. Keep thy shop, and thy shop will keep thee, wasn't just thrift. It was an operating system for enterprises that couldn't depend on imperial coin. When London scolded the colonies for printing notes, Franklin crossed the ocean carrying both samples and statistics. He didn't thunder, he explained. A colony, he said, is not a delinquent. It is a young economy whose credit can be made sound by careful issues tied to taxes and land. He showed ministers paper that behaved and towns that blossomed. He held up a leaf-printed note and let a statesman's hand feel the ridges where a living thing had been pressed into a promise. He won no sweeping doctrine. Empires dislike being taught by provincials. But he won exceptions and renewals, enough to keep workshops busy and markets awake. It was diplomacy by watermark, a technique he would refine later with treaties instead of tens. The post office became a parallel education in circulation. As deputy postmaster for the colonies, Franklin mapped roads with a surveyor's hunger for detail and cut delivery times by measuring post riders' pace with odometer wheels. Information, it turns out, obeys the same rules as currency. Speed, reliability, and coverage decide whose version of reality arrives first. He skimmed no secrets, but he understood routes as a kind of sovereignty. The town that hears the news first sets the price and the mood. The habit stuck. Even in Paris, decades later, he read mail like a merchant reads ledgers, knowing which letters were worth a nudge, which delays were policy in disguise. Printing money also forced him to look hard at value and virtue. He preached frugality because the press showed him how dear a good sheet of paper is and how fast vanity can squander a month's profit. He advised young printers to buy type before velvet, to mind apprentices like sons, and to pay small debts instantly so reputation would compound faster than interest. The ledger that tracked his 13 virtues wasn't a monk's flagellation. It was a foreman's checklist: temperance, so mornings belonged to work; order, so proofs went out clean; sincerity, so clients returned; justice, so contracts renewed without haggling. When he failed, and he admitted he failed often, he recorded it with the same pencil that priced ink and lead. The moral and the material shared a column. There was shrewdness, too, in where he placed his name. On currency, discreet. On pamphlets, playful. On civic plans, sometimes not at all. He preferred a spread of gratitude to a single monument. Yet he knew the long game. If his imprints traveled in every pocket and desk drawer, then when he later argued for stoves, hospitals, academies, or lightning rods, he wouldn't be a stranger knocking. He'd be the fellow who'd been paying out change at the counter for 20 years. That quiet ubiquity, ink in small doses, everywhere, was power disguised as service. When the business grew fat enough to run itself, Franklin did what few proprietors had the nerve to do. He retired early, sold the shop to his partner, David Hall, on an annuity, and bought time to experiment with electricity, convene the Junto, and test the machinery of civic life. The money kept dripping in, a pension from paper, while the city got a Franklin who could spend his afternoons making the intangible tangible. The leaf prints had done their part. He could now print on larger sheets, constitutions, treaties, and the kind of reputation that turns a parlor trick into policy. If you're searching for the hidden life in all this, it isn't a locked drawer of scandal. It's the insight that infrastructure is influence. Control the presses and the posts, and you don't have to shout. The town will start speaking in sentences you set the type for. Franklin learned to make trust physical, a crisp note with a leaf in it, a road with measured miles, a mailbag that arrived when he said it would. Later, when he asked men to trust bigger paper, declarations and treaties, their hands already remembered what his promises felt like. If the Junto was Franklin's homegrown laboratory for civic power, Freemasonry was his plug into an international grid.
He wasn't lured by mysticism. He was attracted to structure. Rituals that made strangers trustworthy. Lodges that turned meetings into networks with manners.
In the 1730s, he printed Masonic constitutions, then joined, and quickly rose, Grand Master of Pennsylvania, before most men finished learning the handshake. The apron and the oaths gave him access to rooms where craftsmen, merchants, and a few grandees sat as equals, at least for an evening. That was Franklin's favorite fiction, a table where rank rested at the door and competence ran the conversation. What did the lodge give him that pamphlets didn't? Predictability. The same order of business from Philadelphia to London to Paris meant a visiting brother knew how to behave and whom to ask for help. In a world before LinkedIn and passports that meant something, a lodge secretary's endorsement could move letters, unlock introductions, and smooth quarrels. Franklin used that rhythm like a metronome to pace bigger work, fundraising for libraries, recruiting for hospitals, stitching together committees that would outlive the night. He wasn't hiding in a secret society, he was standardizing trust. Printing their documents doubled the leverage. He put type to the Masonic charges, charity, truth, relief, and in doing so, edited the order's reputation in the colonies. If the lodge taught tolerance in ritual, Franklin translated it into civic pluralism. Lighting streets, taxing fairly, teaching apprentices, inoculating families. He prized the Masonic ideal of men improved in small increments. The same philosophy behind his 13 virtues, the same ledger habit that turned private slips into public reliability. The overlap wasn't accidental, it was a blueprint. London lodges widened the aperture. A provincial printer could sit with instrument makers, bankers, minor nobility, and learn how ideas hitch rides on commerce, what he already suspected from post roads and paper money. The lodge taught a second lesson he never unlearned. Controversy cools when you assign everyone a part to play. Ritual gave men something to do with their hands while their tempers cooled. Later, in Congress and at the Constitutional Convention, Franklin would improvise secular rituals, recesses, dinners, toasts, whenever arguments tightened like knots. The method was Masonic in spirit. Remind the room that it shares a purpose, then return to the clause at hand. In Paris, Masonic salons overlapped with the old Republic of Letters, a correspondence network of scientists and philosophers who believed in progress the way parishes believe in calendars. Franklin became a kind of node custodian. He could carry a recommendation from a lodge in London to a circle in Passy and have it land softly because the rituals matched even when the languages didn't. He didn't weaponize the network, he irrigated it. Guns and loans crossed the Atlantic on official paper. Goodwill crossed it on lodge paper and calling cards. Was there darkness in the fraternity? Less than the whispered novels suggest, more than a civic sermon would admit. Some lodges mirrored the prejudices of their streets. Some brothers loved hierarchy more than equality once the candles went out. Franklin's answer to imperfection was familiar. Use the parts that work. If a ritual gave a quarrelsome merchant a reason to fund a hospital, keep the ritual. If a title made a useful man vain, print his name on the subscriber list and harvest the vanity for a library. He judged institutions by outputs, not incense.
The best measure of what Masonry did for him is the roster of durable friendships it delivered, men who would sign banknotes, vouch for postal reforms, or send a nephew to study with a better master because Franklin asked. When politics demanded a coalition that looked natural rather than forced, those ties surfaced like a bridge at low tide, already built, already load-bearing. In the hidden ledger, the lodge entries were simple. Introductions earned, promises kept, projects lodged. So the apron mattered less than the architecture behind it. Franklin loved any room that disciplined ego, made conversation rule-bound, and ended the evening with a task list signed by men who meant it. The lodge did that. So did the Junto. So did his dinner tables, where he seated opponents the way a careful mason sets stones that would otherwise crack. You can call it secrecy if you like. He called it assembly, not of symbols, but of citizens, arranged so that tomorrow's work would start itself. If you peel the myth away, the printer saint, the lightning whisperer, the jolly diplomat in a fur cap, you don't find a villain in a cloak. You find a method that ran on two instruments, a ledger and a lantern. The ledger kept strict accounts of favors, failures, names and numbers, what worked, who showed up, where the current actually flowed. The lantern was everything he shone outward, the virtues, the jokes, the parlor experiments, the dinner toasts, the rising sun parable. Ledger for the real, lantern for the persuadable. Franklin's hidden life is simply where the ledger lived, under the desk blotter, in the margins of letters, down the stair to Craven Street's cellar, within the quiet vows of lodges, and behind the patient silences that turned insults into assets. Consider the pattern. In youth, he hides inside masks, do good, busybody, to test ideas without breaking the furniture. As a tradesman, he hides power in infrastructure, posts, notes, libraries, so useful that argument looks stingy beside it. In science, he hides ambition inside replicable tricks. Points and rods become policy because thunder is less frightening once it has a staircase to the ground. In London, he hides a scalpel inside civility. A packet of letters moves, a city flares, a reputation is risked, and he stands still while the storm spends itself. In Paris, he hides steel inside amiability. The rustic sage smiles while freight contracts, secret loans, and alliance clauses slide into place. At home, old and aching, he hides urgency inside wit, publishing a mock sermon that undresses slavery's logic without raising his voice. The mask is never the goal, the movement is. What makes this hiddenness feel honest rather than oily is where it lands. The ledger entries cash out in public goods, hospitals, fire brigades, clean streets, reliable mail, lower lightning deaths, a peace treaty, a constitution that could be amended rather than worshipped or shattered. When he was wrong, on slavery, on the empire's mendability, he amended himself. That may be the real secret, not the dissection bones or the lodge oaths, but a man who updated his priors in public, then used every private channel he had to move the update through the world. Of course, there are shadows. The anatomy school beneath his feet used bodies the law obtained cruelly. The salons he charmed excluded those the century refused to see. The family ledger ends with estrangement where he wanted harmony. Hidden work keeps costs near the worker. Franklin paid some and passed them along, as all builders do.
The important question is whether the structure he left makes it easier for the next generation to pay less and do more. Libraries open later. Posts run faster. Arguments get an ethic. Disagree without heat, make it useful. Even lightning is tamed enough to insure against. He leaves behind not a spotless reputation, he never promised that, but a repeatable procedure for turning private ingenuity into public sense. If you stand the scenes side by side, the Craven Street parlor and its cellar, the Junto's back room and the convention hall, the salon in Passy and the treaty table, the print shop's leaf-printed notes, and the dollars that would someday inherit their logic. You can watch one habit stitch them. Assemble the right people, assign them a ritual, and let usefulness pick the winners. He acts like a mason with citizens as his stones. He files edges, fits quarrels, and, when necessary, chooses a mask that keeps the work from cracking under pride. You can call it manipulation if you like. He called it construction. The last page of his autobiography never got written. History did the finishing paragraph for him. It says roughly, "Here is a way to be dangerous to chaos without dressing like a conqueror. Here is how to turn reputation into a battery. Charge it with ordinary reliability, then spend it where it buys peace. Here is how to move a country toward the person it claims to be, not with a single speech, but with 1,000 small arrangements the public will someday take for granted, which is how you know they're working." That's the real story behind the hidden life. Not a secret vice worth a headline, but a stack of quiet techniques. Masks used as wind tunnels for ideas. Networks treated as roads, not as mirrors. Science converted into policy through demonstrations anyone could repeat. Outrage channeled onto rails aimed at change, not combustion. Apologies made in actions, not in adjectives. Franklin wasn't a saint, and he didn't pretend to be one. He was a foreman of the possible, clocking the job until the scaffolding looked like skyline. So when you picture him now, let the portraits keep their charm, the spectacles, the calm mouth, the cap that made Europe adore its invented Quaker. But add the ledger under his hand and the lantern by his elbow. One measures, one persuades. Between them, a staircase you can still walk, from private draft to public consequence, from good talk to better plumbing, from lightning to law. He lived on that staircase, and he left it lit. Thanks for watching Wisped Tales, where we bring famous lives out of the glare and back into focus. If you enjoyed the real story behind Benjamin Franklin's hidden life, please like, subscribe, and share. It helps a ton. Tell us in the comments which hidden life you want next. We read them, masks off.